Thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to be speaking at the LIBER annual conference. I'm a great admirer of all the work, the public service that research libraries are doing in Europe. And it's a great pleasure for me to be talking about this very important issue of copyright reform, because you can have the best libraries, you can have the best infrastructure, the public funding. If the legal surroundings for libraries are not sound, it's extremely difficult to fulfill the public mission. And in the traditional copyright debates that have been very much focused around professional cultural creation and the remuneration of culture, quite often the impression is given to the public that the people who want to have copyright reform are somehow criminals. It's people who don't want authors to get paid and who just want to get everything for free and don't respect the law. And I think it's very worthy to look at the evidence, to look at who is asking for this copyright reform. And I think it paints a very different picture. As most people in this discussion are not thinking of civil servants, of people who are actually trying to follow the law to the letter and to just be able to fulfill their public interest mission. But this is the reality of who is asking for copyright reform. In 2013, the European Commission did a public survey that was very thorough and was asking about all elements of the European copyright system. And it was indeed the librarians, the universities, archives, museums that were among the strongest supporters of a copyright reform that introduces new exceptions, new flexibility, and most importantly, that takes a European approach to copyright law, so that the offers that are provided by libraries and universities can actually be accessible across borders. And I think that a lot of you will have practical examples from your work of areas where copyright law comes into conflict with the public interest mission that you are given in quite unexpected and counterintuitive ways. And under this European Commission in 2014, this was for the first time publicly recognized in mainstream politics. This mandate started out with the President of the European Commission saying very clearly that copyright reform was at the top of the European agenda, and to also introduce some element of criticism into the current copyright system, namely that the copyright system can actually be a barrier to European digital development, which, coming from a conservative politician, was quite a new and radical view of things. So we were all quite encouraged to see these statements and looking forward to the reform proposal that is now finally on the table. And I think this copyright reform, it could have been quite great. There was wide acknowledgement that there was a problem with European copyright law, but the appointment of Günther Oettinger as the Digital Commissioner in 2014 was already a somewhat bad sign. He was known for being very close to industry, to publishing industry in particular, and also his records of meetings showed that he was not really listening to the voices of academics of the library community in this copyright preparatory work. So when the copyright proposal was finally presented in September, Günther Oettinger moved on to a different area of the European Commission, and he's now responsible for the budget. So even though he is no longer personally involved in this proposal, we are now tasked in the European Parliament to deal with this proposal that has been put on the table. And despite all our best hopes, I have to say that many of the proposals that have been made actually achieve the quite unimaginable to make a bad situation even worse, including for libraries and universities. So I want to give a brief overview of what is in the proposal. First of all, the positive elements. So from a library's perspective, first of all, there's an exception for making copies of materials in the collections of libraries. This is, of course, something that is very overdue. Many countries have such an exception, others do not, or it does not apply in all circumstances. And if you are dealing with an archive where you have content that, for example, is on perishable media, such as film rolls that simply become obsolete and cannot be interpreted anymore after several decades. It's extremely important to be able to legally make copies of all material, regardless of the format in which it is in the archives. However, at the same time, we've heard this morning about efforts to archive born digital works, for example, so works that are not available in the collections of libraries, but openly accessible on the internet. Unfortunately, the proposal by the European Commission of a preservation exception does not allow libraries to harvest publicly accessible content from the internet. And of course, if you want to digitize content available in libraries, in archives, in museums, the purpose of that is not just to preserve it for future generations once the copyright has run out, but to also make it accessible. A lot of this content is not commercially available anymore, so quite often the libraries and archives are the only ways of actually getting access to this material, which can be very important to our cultural heritage. So unfortunately, this exception proposed by the European Commission only covers the reproduction, the digitization, the preservation of the works in the collections, but not actually making them available online, which would mean that libraries and archives would have to continue to deal with the restrictions of today's copyright system, where works can only be made available digitally to the public on dedicated terminals inside the library buildings, which I think in a digital age where people are carrying their own digital devices, where they would like to learn from home, is a huge barrier. There is also an exception for digital teaching included in the Commission proposal, but it only covers situations where the educational use is made inside the classrooms or transmitted through a secure digital network. So it might cover the possibility of people accessing a university intranet over a VPN connection, but we have doubts whether even a password-protected online offer from a university would actually be available to students. So I think there are still quite a lot of unnecessary barriers. And even when this exception is introduced, member states will continue to have the option to have it overwritten by licenses available on the market, which I think is defeating the purpose of having a cross-border exception that allows also students from other countries or who are traveling temporarily to access the offers of these universities. On out-of-commerce works, the proposal facilitates the extended collective licensing, making sure that where these extended collective licensing deals exist, on out-of-commerce works such as older books or photographs, that they can be accessible across borders. However, it does not introduce an exception for out-of-commerce works. So in other words, if there is no collecting society in the country that is representative of a particular type of work, then this proposal will not bring any improvements. And I think this is particularly bad news for museums, for archives that deal with other materials than books or photographs or videos where representative collecting societies might be relatively common, but who deal with things like political posters or other artifacts where there simply is no collecting society that would be representing those rights holders. But there is absolutely no harm done from making these materials accessible, because they're part of our knowledge, of our cultural heritage, but they are not being commercially exploited by anyone. Text and data mining is a topic that we've heard quite a lot about over the course of the last days. The fundamental question that is at the discussion around the text and data mining exception is whether or not you can copy material that you already have access to for data mining purposes. So the material itself, for example, a research article, may be covered by copyright, but the information that you're actually trying to find is usually raw data. So you are not trying to use a copyrighted work for its artistic merit or its originality. You're interested in extracting facts from a database or a basis for your research. So this has been done for a very long time by researchers and companies alike. For example, some researchers have analyzed the vocabulary that was used in Agatha Christie novels to find out whether the author developed Alzheimer's disease over the course of her life. And obviously, in this case, the basis material are artistic works, but the interest is purely scientific. It has nothing to do with appreciating the work as such, but rather analyzing the language that was used. This sort of research has been done. It's been in a legal gray zone that didn't really answer the question whether such copies are copyright infringement or not. But academic publishers have quite frequently been trying to stop the legal licensees who have taken out licenses to access academic journals online from using this text and data mining tools, for example, by applying technological protections against them, for example, restricting the number of articles that can be downloaded, or by applying licensing terms that forbid text and data mining. So in order to stop this sort of bullying of researchers by academic publishers, there has been a demand to the Commission to introduce an exception for text and data mining, to make it clear once and for all that this is not copyright infringement. I think this is a very good idea, but unfortunately the Commission proposed an explicit exception for text and data mining only for research organizations. And of course, if research organizations are explicitly allowed to do text and data mining, is then the other conclusion that everybody who is not in this exception is explicitly forbidden. So for individuals, for citizen scientists, for companies using text and data mining in training artificial intelligence, for example, the situation might get worse through the introduction of this exception. But nevertheless, these exceptions, they're quite disappointing, but perhaps they're not a catastrophe. They're not what we would have liked to see, but it's a missed opportunity in a way. At the same time, there are other elements of this proposal that I think are a lot more dangerous, that could actually be a step back for the research community and for society as a whole, and could put up barriers to archiving and making sustainable our cultural heritage and the knowledge base that we have gathered. And these two proposals address two very basic elements of how the internet works and how we organize information in the digital environment. And one of them is hyperlinking, and the other is hosting of uploaded content by users. So to make this a little bit more practical, because these are very abstract laws, I have come up with 10 everyday things that would become illegal in the case that the Commission's proposal would be adopted one by one. This is not a foregone conclusion, because the European Parliament and the Council now have to discuss this proposal and deal with it. But if they don't want to change it in any way, these 10 things would become illegal, and number 8 is going to make you cry. Number 1, sharing news from 20 years ago. So having a website that simply lists links to news articles about a topic such as the copyright debate in the early 2000s could become an infringement of this new copyright law. This can also hit academic indices of newspaper articles from quite a long time ago, as much as 20 years ago. A second would be tweeting a creative headline, such as Wir sind Papst, which is we are Pope in German. It doesn't even need to contain a link. Simply copying a headline could be an infringement. And the publishers who are lobbying for this change in the law hope that it won't be you who will pay for this sort of use of newspaper articles, but rather it will be Twitter who pays for it. And if Twitter doesn't pay it, unfortunately, you will be liable for it. And of course, the law, it has been designed with social media companies and search engines in mind, but it wouldn't just apply to Twitter, but to any digital reproduction or making available of news extracts, also in intranets of universities, for example. And the third one is sharing a magazine article. Quite a lot of social media platforms today offer automatic previews if you paste the URL into the box to share it with your friends. This sort of function would have to be disabled, and it would not just apply to news websites in the strict sense, but rather also to magazines, blogs, or any websites that have journalistic content and that are written by multiple authors. And I believe that measures like this would make spreading of information online a lot more cumbersome. A fourth one is perhaps less directly relevant to the research community. It's using pinning of a photo to a shopping list on services as Pinterest or other visual bookmarking services. More relevant to research communities and to the way the internet functions is that indexing the web could become illegal. A search engine that is indexing the web for you would have would be no longer allowed to index news websites or magazines without first getting a license for doing so. This would, of course, also apply to academic search portals if there's no exception covering these cases. And from a sustainable knowledge point of view, we're trying to make the online information that is being produced every day accessible and to keep it preserved for future generations. So basically putting in place hurdles to doing so is, I think, very harmful to sustainable knowledge. And regarding the fact that we are talking about a 20-year protection term for news, most of the news will be forgotten by then and nobody will know where to find them if they are not available through indices and search engines. Another thing that would be prohibitive would be the unmonitored upload of photos to websites such as Photo Community or Flickr. So websites where you can share photos would have to put in place a filter to make sure that copyright infringing content would not be put on these platforms in the first place. This does not just apply to photographs, but to all manners of copyrighted content. So for example, software. A lot of people in the research community are using GitHub as a repository for open source software. And of course, software in principle is protected by copyright. GitHub as a platform specializes in open source software that can be freely shared. However, the proposal does not discriminate between openly licensed content and other copyrighted content. So also platforms like GitHub would have to put in place a filter that can automatically detect copyright infringements that might occur in the future. And yeah, number 8, I promised it. Of course, the same would apply to repositories. As long as users are allowed to upload content unsupervised by themselves, these content recognition technologies would need to be put in place in order to avoid infringement, whether or not there is really a problem of widespread copyright infringement in the first place. Another possible collateral damage of this would be websites like Wikipedia, where content is uploaded under a free license or in the public domain. It doesn't matter if there really is a lot of infringement happening in practice, or indeed if the platform has an interest in keeping illegal content online. The assumption is that there are somewhat abusive online platforms out there who are hoping that their users are going to upload illegal content and they can capitalize on it. But a law that tries to target those companies, of course, at the same time targets any platform that is actually encouraging users to make legal use of freely licensed content. And finally, perhaps not quite as everyday as the other examples, is training your artificial intelligence. When you're training artificial intelligence, you usually have to analyze large amounts of text, pictures, through a process of text and data mining. So for example, if you are training an algorithm to recognize speech, you need to have lots of recordings of speech and also transcripts of the same speech in order to be able to feed it to the algorithm to get better. So if you are dealing with artificial intelligence, the proposal may also cause problems for you. So you may ask yourself how all these somewhat catastrophic measures could come in place and what kind of proposals lie behind it. And there are two proposals, two articles of the new copyright directive that I would like to draw your attention to, because I think they have not been at the forefront of the library discussion. There has been, rightfully so, a lot of attention being paid to the new exceptions, but I think we are facing the danger of, on the one hand, making one step forward with some new exceptions for the benefit of libraries and universities, when at the same time we're making 2 steps back by allowing new extensions of copyright that would invariably hurt the research community and the society as a whole. So the first proposal in this regard is a new layer of copyright protection for news publishers, a so-called neighboring right. This neighboring right would be distinct from the copyright that journalists already earn in any article that they write. Usually the status quo today is the journalist writes an article, they have copyright in this article, and their exclusive rights are transferred or licensed exclusively to publishers in most cases. This new proposal introduces an extra layer of protection for the publishers themselves. It would apply for 20 years, and it would apply retroactively. So newspaper articles published 20 years ago would be protected by this new right. A website with a list of news stories about the Napster case, as the one that I showed in the beginning, that has quotes from the articles would be illegal. But you might wonder now, isn't actually quoting legal anyway, because there's an exception for that? Well, the problem is that the exception for quotation is not harmonized across the EU, and it means different things in different countries. So, for example, in my country, Germany, a quotation is only legal if it is put into a broader context of criticism or review. So if you have a website where you are publishing, for example, all the articles that were published about your research in the media, for example, you are not criticizing the content of these articles. You're just giving information to your readers about where they can find more information about your work. Something like this would not be covered by the quotation exception, and therefore you would have to pay a license fee to the publishers for being able to link to the articles that they have written about your own work. The intended targets of this new neighboring right for publishers were made clear by the former Digital Commissioner Günther Oettinger right in the beginning. And these targets were Twitter, the iPhone, tablets, and Facebook. And I think you can see from this list that maybe there's not quite a clear understanding about who exactly is supposed to pay for this new right. On the one hand, you have online services like Facebook and Twitter who are somehow supposed to pay publishers. Then you have the iPhone, which is a particular product. And then you have tablets, which are an entire range of products. So it's not really clear how a new copyright law can create a transfer of value from these companies producing tablets to newspaper publishers. But apparently this is the goal. It's quite ironic because publishers actually employ experts to optimize the way that they show up on social media companies such as Facebook or Twitter, and they actively collaborate with search engines, with social media platforms in order to make sure that their content can be found. So it's quite counterintuitive to say that these services are somehow hurting the publishers by using snippets that the publishers actually want to put on these websites. A similar law has been passed in Germany in 2013, and it failed in the sense that the publishers ended up paying a lot more money in legal fees than they ever got in revenue, and generally newspaper articles were simply delisted from services such as search engines that would have to pay for them, which finally led to publishers giving a free license to Google to show their content on Google News results, but not to their smaller competitors. So a law that was supposed to extract money from Google and give it to the publishers actually ended up strengthening the market position of Google, but at the same time having a collateral damage on community projects, on not-for-profits that are trying to make older newspaper articles accessible in the form of hyperlinks, quite simply. Günther Oettinger also made a quite interesting statement about what kinds of sentences or headlines would be protected by this new law. And he said we're not talking about purely factual headlines like airplane crash in Africa. There has to be an individual intellectual effort. Two comments on this. First of all, it gives the impression that Commissioner Oettinger thinks that Africa is a country. This is not the case. Secondly, it's actually not true that this proposal would not cover purely factual headlines. A neighboring right, unlike a copyright, does not have an element of originality. It protects an investment in a certain creation. So, for example, a neighboring right for a sound recording protects a snippet of a recording as short as 1 or 2 seconds. And there are actually court cases illustrating this quite recently. So this means that in theory, a single word would be covered by this law, but obviously this would be not very practical. So probably courts would have to set the thresholds at different numbers of words that you're still allowed to quote without having to pay for it. So something like wir sind Papst, 3 words, certainly creative, it would most certainly be covered by this law. There actually is no exception for private individuals or for non-commercial use in this proposal. So unlike the German law, which applies only to news engines, search engines and news aggregators, it would apply to everyone, including non-commercial repositories or linked collections to older newspaper articles. Unfortunately, also unlike the German law, this new proposal would apply to making copies as such, not just to the making available. So even indexing news sites without actually showing large parts of the articles in the search results would already be an infringement. This is because indexing creates copies of the articles, and so far this was illegal under a mandatory exception for incidental copies. So these are temporary copies that are done for the pure facilitation of a legal use. And when displaying search results of newspaper articles is legal, then making the copies is legal. However, if showing the search results is no longer legal, then this would be an infringement. So this would also affect academic indices where no exception of copyright applies. This new proposal relies on the definition of press publication that is quite broad and that read by itself could even apply to academic journals. It says that it has to have some journalistic content, but it may also comprise other works or subject matter. So in the case of a regular academic publication, quite often you have a journalistic article in the editorial, so it would in principle apply to this, or it would fall under this definition. Currently, the Commission proposal in a recital says that academic journals should not be covered by this proposal. However, there are some amendments from members of parliament tabled that would remove this exception. So there is also this danger that the proposal would even be extended beyond what is originally intended. So this also explains why pinning a picture in a service like Pinterest would fall under this proposal, because even the picture that is used in a newspaper article, regardless of who actually took the picture, would be covered by this neighboring right for publishers, because it would be part of the press publication. But services like Pinterest actually have a much bigger problem with the Article 13, the proposal regarding content filters. So this is a quite complicated and perhaps deliberately complicated piece of legal text, and I will try to explain it in simple terms. So this article includes 2 alternative obligations. It applies to information society service providers, so host providers on the internet where users can upload works. And these providers, if they have large amounts of works, either have to get a license from rights holders and then enforce it, for example, through content monitoring technology, or they have to proactively prevent the availability of copyrighted works identified by rights holders, for example, again, through content monitoring technologies. This is quite different from the legal obligation these host providers have today, which is the notice and takedown regime. So you are not generally liable for copyright infringement committed by your users, but if you are informed of a copyright infringement on your hosting platform, you have to expeditiously remove this content in order to avoid liability. Preventing availability of copyrighted content implies that such a retroactive takedown, once you've gotten information about illegal behavior, is not enough anymore, but that the control would take place before the upload becomes successful to the public. There is, of course, an elephant in the room. The reason why this proposal is made is because of an ongoing conflict between the video sharing website YouTube and the music industry. And when this proposal is talking about content recognition, the use case that the European Commission has in mind, and this also becomes clear from the impact assessment, is finding music recordings that have been uploaded illegally. The music industry usually has licensing deals with YouTube, but they think that YouTube does not pay enough in comparison to fully licensed services such as Spotify. So their solution is that they want to make the license deals the less painful option in comparison to using content recognition for everything. But this law would actually apply not just to YouTube, but to all kinds of host providers that have large amounts of content, and to all types of copyrighted works, not just recorded music. So YouTube would probably have the least problems complying with this new law because they already have a content filter in place for music, and they would probably be in a better position to extend it to other types of copyrighted content. The collateral damage in the meantime would be repositories. You might ask yourself, if you're a lawyer, wait a second, is a website like Archive even such an information society service providers? The definition of information society service providers says that these are services normally provided for remuneration. So you could think archive.org is freely accessible, it's not really a problem. Unfortunately, the case law around normally provided for information says that something is normally provided for information already if it's asking for donations, so Wikipedia would be covered, and also if somebody else is providing the same service for money. So this means as long as there are commercial repositories out there, the non-commercial repositories would also be covered by this definition. So of course, there aren't really that many copyright infringements on Wikipedia or archive.org. However, the proposal, if you look at the text, nowhere says that it's about large amounts of copyright infringements. It's about large amounts of copyrighted content. And of course, even CC licensed content is copyrighted and therefore falls under the definitions. Large amounts is at the same time undefined, but the examples that I've given of archive.org, of photo community, GitHub, and Wikipedia, these are all community websites that host well over 1 million works. So it's quite clear that regardless which definition of large amounts you would take, these kinds of websites would fall under them. And this brings us to a very difficult practical problem, because these host providers would either have to start paying rights holders license fees or to start filtering, regardless of whether or not there actually is a problem with copyright infringement. So what do they have to filter? Well, the proposal says they have to prevent the availability of copyrighted works. Recordings of music, filtering those is relatively easy by comparison to other works. However, copyrighted works can be all kinds of things. Translations of texts can be copyrighted. Using a character from another film in your film can be a copyright infringement. And even using a character in your academic discussion of a particular film can be a copyright infringement if you're not covered by a copyright exception. Reusing code, open source code that you have found without respecting the license conditions can be a copyright infringement. The sculpture that is shown on this picture is in a public park and it is protected by copyright. So if you are living in a country that does not have an exception for freedom of panorama that allows you to take pictures of publicly displayed artworks, then you would even need to be able to have an algorithm that recognizes this sculpture being photographed from all different angles, because the photograph of this sculpture would be a copyright infringement. And according to US case law by the European Court of Justice, even a hyperlink can be a copyright infringement. If a user knowingly links to copyright infringing content on another website, then the link itself is a copyright infringement. So this brings the hosting providers into a somewhat awkward situation where if they have to scan for copyright infringements on their own websites, they would theoretically have to scan the content of the websites that their users link to and the users' brains to find out whether or not they knew about the infringing content. The European Commission's response to this, Vice President Andrus Ansip recently answered questions by the Legal Affairs Committee in the Parliament that is responsible for copyright questions, and he was asked about the financial burden this would put on hosting providers who have to install these content recognition technologies. And he said that Audible Magic, which is such a content recognition technology, costs only $400 a month. Audible Magic, first of all, only detects music recordings, so installing this software would not be enough to comply with the legal obligation. Companies using Audible Magic actually pay much more. The lowest price on Audible Magic's own websites start for 1,000 euros a month for only detecting up to 10,000 or scanning up to 10,000 music recordings. And of course, on top of that, you have the staff costs of actually administering and installing such software. And even if the number of 400 euros per month were correct, this is perhaps not a burden on a company like YouTube, but imagining this as an additional cost on the budget of a university library's repository is quite a different story. And ironically, the European Court of Justice actually declared a national obligation to use a filter like Audible Magic incompatible with the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. So it's difficult to see how the same obligation coming from the European legislator would suddenly be respecting fundamental rights such as the freedom of expression, the right to privacy of the users, and the freedom to conduct the business of hosting companies. There are some latest developments in the European Commission that might change the picture. I mentioned earlier that the Digital Commissioner who was responsible for drafting this proposal has left to the budget portfolio, and he was replaced by a Bulgarian former member of the European Parliament, Maria Gabriel. She's also a member of the Conservatives, didn't work on digital policy before, and there is not too much known about her position so far. She has been heard by the European Parliament, and in this hearing, she did defend the upload filter proposal made by the European Commission and put a lot of emphasis on the author's perspective, even in questions that were asked about making cultural heritage accessible. However, she is much younger, she perhaps has a different perspective on digital topics, and it is still possible for her to influence the negotiations that are now going to start in the European institutions quite decisively. At the same time, the work in the European Parliament is progressing. There are different committees that are giving an opinion to the leading committee on what should be done about this copyright proposal. And one of them has already voted, which is the Committee for Internal Market and Consumer Protection. And this committee, first of all, removed the obligation for hosting providers to filter content because it had concerns about the compatibility with fundamental rights, and it does not want to place liability on such platforms unless they are actually actively involved in the user uploads in a way that gives them knowledge of copyright infringement happening. It protects the right of users to actually put online legal content under exception, and for the text and data mining exception, it proposes to explicitly include cultural heritage institutions among the beneficiaries. Unfortunately, it did not go as far as proposing a text and data mining exception for everyone, a proposal that I think was defeated by just 1 or 2 votes. Unfortunately, it also does nothing about the proposal on neighboring rights for publishers. The next vote is already coming up next week on Tuesday when the Culture Committee is going to vote. And there, the library community has already been quite active in highlighting some of the concerns, because the copyright amendments that seem to share a majority support in this committee would significantly limit the text and data mining exception beyond what is already quite narrow in the Commission proposal. So first of all, the Culture Committee will most likely propose that the text and data mining exception would only apply to legally acquired content rather than legally accessed content. So then the question is, would it even apply to things that are freely accessible on the internet if you haven't actually paid to get access to it? It also proposes that the copies must be deleted after the research is concluded, which certainly would make the reproduction of the research results impossible. And finally, it proposes a mandatory compensation of rights holders for text and data mining, which seems quite absurd if you imagine, for example, data mining millions of pictures that have been put on the internet. In order for this compensation to actually be paid to the rights holders, one would have to find out who the rights holders are, which is an impossible task. So most likely this compensation would not end up with the people whose content was actually used, but rather with collecting societies who wouldn't then be able to actually distribute it fairly. The proposal by the Culture Committee also foresees that these content filters would apply in even more cases, namely that it would be extended to platforms that do not make content accessible to the public, but only store content that is uploaded by users. So this would include university intranets and also services like Dropbox, where you can simply upload things for the cloud for your own benefit in the future. It also wants to make it apply to hosting platforms that are not actually hosting anything at all, but only making available. So streaming services, for example, that are used for streaming of lectures without permanently storing the videos would be covered by that. And the content filter should even apply in cases when the right holder has not requested it, which to me seems impossible, considering that virtually everything is protected by copyright. The neighboring right should have is also supported by this committee. So there, I think that the discussions in this committee are going in a very bad direction. At the same time, in the leading legal affairs committee, we are witnessing currently a U-turn of what the parliament's largest group, the EPP group, seems to want from this copyright reform. At the beginning of the process, the EPP group appointed a rapporteur, so this is the chief negotiator for the European Parliament of the copyright reform, Ms. Therese Comodini-Kakia, and she actually took this role very seriously. She heard over 100 stakeholders, including a lot of academics, and she made a first draft that would have mitigated the biggest problems, would have removed the new neighboring right for publishers, and actually extended the text and data mining exception to everyone. Then she got elected to the Maltese parliament, so she has now left the European Parliament and was replaced by one of her colleagues, Mr. Axel Voss from the German EPP group. The amendments that he has already tabled show that he wants to rather double down on the path that the Commission has taken, and he will, of course, have to get a majority for whatever he wants to get through the Parliament, so he will have to try to make compromises, but it seems that he will have to start from scratch with that, because, of course, he has not met with 100 academics, and therefore does not have the same preparation that was already put into this, and also a lot of work that was put into informing politicians about the issues that the academic community has. And this compromise finding process has just been made a bit more complicated, because the EPP group yesterday published an adopted position on copyright law that significantly differs from the proposal, the draft report that was written up by their own rapporteur, Ms. Comodini Kakia. So on the text and data mining exception, it says that they can accept what the Commission has proposed, the text and data mining exception for research organizations, but anything beyond that should be out of the question, because it risks interfering with well-functioning licensing markets, and it might violate the Berne Convention's three-step test. So basically, the assumption here is that whenever a company wants to conduct text and data mining, that licenses are actually available to do so without a copyright exception, which, if you're trying to mine content from a large number of different rights holders, it can be millions of rights holders, is clearly not the case. On the Article 13, the content filters, they say that platforms which store and give access to copyright-protected content uploaded by their users should be liable for their use of this copyrighted content. So this means for somebody who is providing a platform for users to upload, for example, research articles, if the users break copyright law, it's the platform provider who is liable for that. So this is quite an extreme change from the notice and takedown approach that we have today. And on the publisher's neighboring right, the EPP group is now in favor of it, after originally their rapporteur had proposed to remove it. So the situation in the European Parliament is not very good. The reform that has started as quite an encouraging stories for libraries and researchers has turned into something that is looking more like a threat every day. And there is a real danger that the few steps in the right direction, such as the preservation exception, will not in any way justify the additional burdens that will be put on repositories and on the sharing of news. But the good news is that libraries actually in the copyright debate have managed to gain quite a lot of respect and quite a lot of power. And this is precisely because everybody recognizes that librarians and universities fulfill an important public interest mission. And thankfully today nobody is seriously proposing to abolish libraries, but I have to say that if libraries were invented today, it would probably be seen as an extremely radical idea to give access to knowledge for free for people who are not willing to pay for it, and probably publishers would oppose it quite radically. But this is not the situation we have. People are actually willing to listen to the experiences of librarians, and organizations such as LIBER have proven that they have the ear of legislators. And it's a question of persistence, it's a question of bringing these experiences to the people who generally, I think, do not intend to hurt libraries and their missions, but rather are subjected to very intense lobbying from a small number of copyrighted industries. You can see that there is this general intention to help cultural heritage preservation, also from a recent initiative by the European institutions that is making the year 2018 the European Year of Cultural Heritage. Parliament and Council have just adopted a call for accessibility of cultural heritage. It says in this plan for the European Year of Cultural Heritage that one of the goals is to promote solutions which make cultural heritage accessible to all, including via digital means. This proposal also says that born digital works should be preserved. So there are quite a lot of intentions that the European institutions have put their weight behind that really conflict with some of the developments in the copyright proposal. So I think it's extremely important that libraries and other institutions involved in the preservation and the accessibility of cultural heritage stand up and make it clear that if this copyright reform is not corrected, it will counteract the very goal of the initiative on the Year of Cultural Heritage that has just been started. News, user uploads to repositories, research results from text and data mining, all of this is part of our common heritage, and it will be made inaccessible or even have to be deleted if some of the discussed changes to the copyright law take place. So I think it's very important that we build quite broad alliances. This has already happened in the European Parliament, where you have members from almost all political groups in the Parliament, except for the far right, who have tabled amendments in the public interest in order to protect libraries, internet users, startups, researchers, and so on. And we need similarly broad alliances and cooperation and coordination between the civil society organizations, the startups, the research organizations who are calling for copyright reform in order to support those progressive voices in the parliament, and also the national governments and council who are trying to advance an open science agenda. So don't let the progressive voices on copyright be divided, but rather team up with other actors who want a similar copyright reform. The vote in the Culture Committee is next week on Tuesday, and the leading jury committee will vote in October. It's not too late to change, but we have seen it quite a few times in the last days. The time to act on copyright reform is now. Thank you.
I would like, we have a short extension in the talk, but as you can understand, it was impossible for me to intervene and try to cut this very enlightening presentation. It was a roller coaster to what is happening right now in the European Commission, in the European Parliament, and I'm sure that not many of us have access to this filtered information and very targeted. So we have selective dissemination of information right now here in our venue. We still have time for 2 questions because we need to move to the program and some of you are leaving. So if you would like, yes, please, the microphone to the President of LIBER.
Thank you very much for this presentation. It was fantastic, and as you saw, our audience appreciated this a lot. First of all, I would like to say to all LIBER libraries that LIBER is lobbying heavily on this. There was also Twitter about the statement, so LIBER has provided statement on especially text and data mining, but we are planning to prepare a new statement. And also early on we have visited the commissioners Ottinger and Ansip on this issue, text and data mining, and now we'll try to also meet the new commissioner, Maria Gabriel. And here, if we still have some Bulgarian delegates, I'd like to discuss a bit after this session to make this practically happen. But Julia, as we have now people from several countries here, what would you recommend these representatives to do really to help the progress?
My experience is that in order to influence a politician's opinion, 2 elements are extremely important. First of all, they need to have a reason to want to talk to you, and there, unfortunately, nationality is still quite a decisive factor simply because of the language barriers. So look at who is in the Legal Affairs Committee in the European Parliament, which is the main responsible for the copyright reform. See if there are members from your country and contact them with your library organization, with your national organization. This has been known to be quite effective because most of the time there are not bad intentions behind supporting such proposals, but simply not having heard all the different perspectives. And the other element is, of course, that people are much more likely to listen if you know what their interests are. So rather than just researching who is there, it's also important to research what their particular interests are, what their party affiliation is, and so on. So for example, conservative members or liberal members perhaps are more interested in hearing about the business consequences of copyright reform in terms of barriers being put up for startups, for European internet companies, whereas politicians on the left might be more open to hear about the public interest missions of libraries in their particular concerns. Of course, this is a generalization, but there is a lot of information available about all of us politicians, so it's quite easy to find out what we're interested in, what our political goals are, and copyright generally is not a very ideological issue in the sense that you have politicians in almost all parties who want a copyright reform for different reasons, and at the same time you have people in all parties who want to keep everything the way it is today. I think it's also very important not to forget the Council, because at the same time that the European Parliament is discussing these changes, the ministries of justice and culture, usually whichever ministry is responsible for copyright, are discussing these proposals in the Council. Currently, the Council presidency lies with Estonia, which will be responsible for finding a compromise among all member state governments on this text. So engaging with your justice ministries, your culture ministries, whoever is working on copyright reform is also extremely important right now.
Another question maybe? If not, then I would like all of us to show our appreciation again to our keynote speaker.